The first time the wind howled across the valley that winter, it sounded like a warning. It came rolling down from the high ridges, sweeping over the frozen grass and rattling the walls of the small log cabin that stood alone at the edge of the prairie. The cabin had been built with steady hands and stubborn hope, each log notched and laid by someone who believed that hard work could tame even the wildest land. Smoke rose thin and gray from its chimney, drifting sideways under a pale sky. Inside, the fire cracked softly. Outside, the world was already sharpening itself into ice. She had felt that wind before. She knew its temper. The cabin sat on a rise just above a narrow creek that ran strong in spring and turned to a sheet of glass by late fall. Beyond it stretched miles of open land, broken only by low hills and scattered pines that leaned away from the gusts. In summer, the place looked wide and golden, almost gentle. In winter, it became something else entirely. The snow did not simply fall there. It took possession. She had lived in that cabin long enough to understand that beauty and danger often shared the same face. Years earlier, when she first came to that stretch of land, people in the nearest settlement had shaken their heads. They said the valley was too open, too exposed. They said the storms rolled in without mercy. They said a woman alone would not last through her first hard winter. She had listened without argument. Then she had gone back to her work. Her days were filled with chores that left no room for doubt, hauling water from the creek before it froze solid, splitting wood until her hands burned through her gloves, mending fences bent by roaming cattle and restless winds. She wore her hair braided down her back and tied it tight, the way her mother once had. Her dresses were plain and practical, always covered by a heavy apron. There was nothing fancy about her life, but there was pride in it. The cabin itself was sturdy, built low and tight against the wind. Its windows were small, its door thick and heavy. Beneath the floor there was a narrow crawlspace dug into the earth, mostly used for storing potatoes and jars of preserved beans. But that was not the only thing beneath her cabin. The idea had come to her one autumn evening as she watched the sun sink red behind the hills. The air had carried a strange stillness, the kind that often meant a storm was gathering somewhere far off. She had remembered stories told by older settlers, stories of blizzards that buried entire barns, of men who walked out to fetch firewood and never found their way back, of cabins swallowed so completely that only a faint hump in the snow marked where a family had once slept. She did not fear easily, but she respected the land. That night, by the light of an oil lamp, she studied the floorboards and the ground beneath. The crawlspace was shallow and uneven, barely enough to keep root vegetables from freezing. If a storm came hard enough, snow could drift high against the walls. If the chimney clogged or the door froze shut, she might be trapped. If the roof sagged under too much weight, the whole cabin could fail. The thought did not send her into panic. It sent her into planning. The next morning, she began to dig. At first, it was just an extension of the crawlspace. She cleared out the potatoes and jars, stacking them carefully in one corner of the main room. Then she took a shovel and a pickaxe and went to work beneath the cabin. The earth was cold but not yet frozen solid. She carved into it inch by inch, hauling the dirt out in buckets and piling it behind the house where no one would see. Day after day she worked alone. The sound of metal biting into soil echoed under the floorboards. Her shoulders ached, her palms blistered. Still, she continued. She did not tell anyone in town what she was doing. It was not their business. Let them think she was preparing extra firewood or fixing a loose beam. The truth was simpler and deeper. She was building herself a hidden shed beneath her own home, a place carved into the ground where the wind could not reach. She reinforced the walls with thick planks cut from spare timber. She drove wooden beams into the packed earth to hold the ceiling steady. The space grew wide enough for her to sit upright, then wide enough for a small cot. She built shelves along one side and filled them with canned meat, dried corn, flour, and lantern oil. She carried down blankets and a heavy quilt stitched years ago from scraps of old dresses. When it was finished, the hidden shed lay concealed beneath a trapdoor cut neatly into the cabin floor, hidden under a woven rug. No one standing in the main room would guess what lay below. It was not large, but it was strong. The earth itself wrapped around it like a shield. As winter approached, she tested it. She lit a lantern below and closed the trapdoor. The air stayed steady. The cold did not bite as sharply underground. Even when the wind pushed hard against the cabin walls, the space beneath remained still. She did not build it out of fear. She built it out of memory. She had seen what a snowstorm could do. That winter came early. The first heavy snowfall blanketed the valley before Thanksgiving. It clung to the cabin roof and pressed against the door. She shoveled paths to the woodpile and the creek, her breath rising in thick clouds. Each night she listened to the wind as it prowled around the corners of the house. By mid-January, the snow lay deep and hard, crusted over by weeks of freezing nights. The sky turned a dull gray that seemed never to lift. Even the animals grew quiet. The world felt smaller, closed in by white walls that rose higher each day. Then the storm came. It began with a distant rumble, not thunder, but something heavier, as if the sky itself were shifting. She stepped outside just before dusk and saw the line of it advancing from the north, a wall of snow and wind, thick and fast. The air tasted metallic and sharp. She hurried back inside and barred the door. Within minutes, the wind struck. The cabin shuddered under the force of it. Snow blasted against the window so fiercely that she could no longer see beyond the glass. The chimney groaned. Fine powder forced its way through the smallest cracks, dusting the floor like sifted flour. She fed the fire with steady hands, refusing to let it falter. The storm did not weaken through the night. It grew stronger. By morning, the front door would not budge. Snow had piled high against it, sealing it shut. The windows were nearly buried. The sound outside was no longer a howl, but a roar, constant and consuming. The roof beams creaked under the weight above. She moved calmly, though her heart beat hard in her chest. She had prepared for this. Still, when a sudden crack echoed overhead and a shower of snow fell down the chimney, her breath caught. The fire sputtered. Smoke curled into the room, thick and choking. She coughed and pulled her apron over her mouth. The chimney was clogging. Another crack sounded, louder this time. The cabin had always felt strong. Now it felt small. She glanced at the rug near the center of the floor. Beneath it lay the trapdoor. Beneath that, the hidden shed she had carved with her own hands. The wind slammed against the walls again, and something heavy struck the side of the cabin. A beam shifted with a sharp snap. Snow spilled from the ceiling in a thin stream. She did not hesitate. Pulling the rug aside, she lifted the trapdoor and grabbed the lantern from the table. Smoke thickened around her as she lowered herself into the earth. The air below felt cooler but clearer. She reached up and pulled the trapdoor closed, just as a deafening crash shook the cabin above. For a moment there was only darkness and the distant roar of the storm. Then she struck a match. The lantern flame flickered to life, casting soft light across the wooden beams and packed earth walls. The small space felt close but solid. The shelves stood steady. The cot waited in the corner. Above her, the storm raged on. She sat on the edge of the cot, listening. Snow thudded against the cabin roof. Another heavy crack split the air, followed by a long grinding sound that made her stomach tighten. The cabin was taking the full force of the blizzard now. Whether it would hold or not, she could not tell. She wrapped the quilt around her shoulders and steadied her breathing. She had built this place for a reason. She had trusted her instincts when others doubted her. Down here, beneath the frozen earth, she was protected from the wind that could tear wood apart and bury doors beyond reach. But even underground, she could feel the violence of the storm above. Hours passed, or perhaps only minutes. Time moved strangely in that hidden shed. The lantern burned low. The ground trembled once more, stronger than before, and a muffled crash shook dust from the ceiling beams. The sound did not stop quickly. It rolled and shifted as if something large had given way. Her hands tightened around the quilt. Was it just a section of roof? A fallen tree? Or had the entire cabin begun to collapse under the crushing weight of snow? The roar outside did not lessen. If the cabin had fallen, the hidden shed might now be buried deeper than she had ever planned. She rose slowly, stepping toward the trapdoor. For a long moment she simply stared at it. If she opened it too soon, the snow could pour in. If she waited too long, she might lose her only chance to see what remained above. Another heavy thud shook the earth around her. Holding the lantern high, she reached for the latch and began to lift the door, unsure of what she would find on the other side. The latch felt colder than the rest of the wood, as if the storm had already found a way to touch it. She lifted the trapdoor slowly, inch by inch, bracing herself for a rush of snow. For a moment, nothing happened. The lantern light pushed up into a narrow opening filled with drifting powder and dim gray light. Then a small cascade of snow slid through the crack and spilled onto the floor beside her. She lowered the door at once. Her breath came quick, but she forced it steady again. The cabin was still there. If it had completely collapsed, the weight above would have crushed the trapdoor or buried it too tightly to move. But something had shifted. The sound she had heard was not just a loose branch falling. It had been heavier than that, closer, nearer to the heart of the house. She stepped back from the door and listened. The storm roared without pause. It did not rise and fall like ordinary wind. It pressed constantly, as if determined to grind everything flat. The hidden shed felt strong, but the noise above made it clear that the cabin was fighting for its life. She set the lantern on the shelf and moved to check the beams she had placed months earlier. Each one stood firm in the packed earth. She ran her hand along the wood, feeling for cracks. There were none. The ground around her remained solid, holding its shape. The earth was her shelter now. As she stood there, she found her thoughts drifting back to the day she first began carving out this space. It had not only been the old stories that pushed her to do it. It had been something more personal, something she rarely allowed herself to revisit. Years ago, before she ever owned this patch of land, she had spent a winter in another valley farther east. She had not been alone then. There had been a small farmhouse, a larger barn, and a handful of neighbors close enough to ride to in an hour if the weather held. They had thought that closeness was protection. It had not been enough. One January night, a blizzard had rolled in without warning. The temperature dropped so fast that water buckets froze solid in minutes. Snow fell thick and fast, piling against doors and windows. The men had tried to keep paths open between the house and the barn. They had tied ropes around their waists so they would not lose their way in the whiteout. By morning, the barn roof had collapsed. The animals were lost beneath timber and snow. The farmhouse chimney clogged, just as hers had begun to do. Smoke filled the rooms. There had been shouting, coughing, confusion. When the storm finally passed, it left behind more than broken wood. She rarely spoke of that winter. She carried it quietly, like a scar hidden under clothing. That memory was the true reason she dug beneath her cabin. She would not be caught unprepared again. Above her now, another heavy impact struck the roof. A low groan followed, long and splintering. The sound traveled down through the floorboards into the earth itself. She pressed her hand to the packed wall, as if she could steady the cabin from below. Snow sifted through the edges of the trapdoor once more. If the roof gave way completely, the weight might settle across the floor. The beams of the main room were strong, but they were not meant to hold an entire drift of wind-packed snow. The hidden shed would protect her from the worst of the wind and cold, but it could also become a sealed pocket beneath a collapsed house. She thought of the small shovel she had left leaning against the wall near the cot. She had placed it there on purpose. If the entrance became blocked, she would have to dig her way out. The idea was possible in theory. In practice, digging through frozen earth and packed snow alone would take strength and time she might not have. The lantern flame flickered as the air shifted. She adjusted the wick and checked the oil level. There was enough for many hours if she kept it low. On the shelf above, jars of preserved beans and salted meat waited in neat rows. Sacks of flour and cornmeal sat tied tight against moisture. A small jug of water rested beside them, drawn from the creek before the storm struck. She had prepared for days underground if necessary. Yet, even with food, water, and warmth, there was something she could not prepare for: isolation. The storm had cut her off completely. No one from the settlement would attempt the journey through this. Even if they wished to, they would not know whether she needed help. She had chosen this land knowing its risks. She had accepted that some battles would be faced alone. Another shudder rippled through the cabin above, followed by a sharp cracking sound that made her flinch. Dust drifted down from between the planks overhead. The noise did not stop quickly this time. It dragged on, wood scraping against wood, as if a section of the roof were slowly folding inward. Her heart pounded against her ribs. She moved back to the trapdoor again. This time she pressed her ear against it, listening for any change in the storm's voice. Beneath the wind's roar, she heard something new. A hollow tone, different from the steady thud of snow. It sounded like open space where there should have been solid wood. A part of the roof had likely caved in. If snow poured through that opening, it would fill the main room quickly. The stove might be buried, the table and chairs crushed. The front door, already sealed shut, would disappear entirely behind a wall of ice. The cabin she had built with such care could be reduced to a mound under the blizzard. And she was beneath it. She swallowed hard but refused to let fear take control. Panic would waste breath and strength. She forced herself to think clearly. The hidden shed was built against the north side of the crawlspace, where the ground rose slightly. If the southern portion of the roof had collapsed, the weight might settle unevenly. That could either shield the trapdoor or press directly against it. She imagined the structure above, log by log, beam by beam. She had helped raise some of those beams. She knew their thickness, their grain. She pictured how the snow would lie across them, where it would drift deepest. The storm was coming from the north, driving snow hard against the front of the cabin. Another impact struck, closer this time. The lantern trembled on its shelf. Then came a sound that chilled her more than the cold ever could. A long, heavy thump, followed by sudden stillness above. The wind still roared outside, but directly overhead there was a strange quiet, as if part of the cabin had settled into place and stopped moving. She waited, barely breathing. The silence did not mean safety. It could mean that a section of roof had fallen and now lay flat, pressed under tons of snow. It could mean that the worst was yet to come, that the remaining beams were now bearing more weight than they could handle. She thought of the settlement miles away. She pictured the small general store, its porch buried in drifts. She imagined other cabins fighting their own battles against the blizzard. Perhaps somewhere a child was crying in fear, or an old man was feeding his stove with trembling hands. Winter did not choose its victims carefully. It tested everyone. Her own fight had started long before this storm. It began the day she decided she would not depend on luck or charity to survive. The hidden shed was proof of that decision. She moved back to the cot and sat down slowly. The quilt around her shoulders felt heavier now. She stared at the lantern flame, letting its steady glow anchor her thoughts. She could not stop the storm. She could only endure it. Minutes passed, stretching thin and tight. Then, without warning, the trapdoor jerked upward half an inch as something heavy shifted above it. A burst of snow forced its way through the gap, scattering across the floor. She sprang to her feet and pressed both hands against the door, pushing it closed. The pressure from above increased. It felt as if the snow itself were trying to pry the door open. She leaned her full weight against it, boots braced against the packed earth. The wood creaked under strain. Fine powder sifted down around her sleeves and into her collar. If the door gave way completely, the shed would fill quickly. For several long seconds, the pressure held. Then it eased slightly, as though whatever had shifted above had settled again. She did not move right away. Her arms trembled from the effort, but she kept pressing upward until she was certain the door would not rise again on its own. Slowly, carefully, she stepped back. The edges of the trapdoor were now rimmed with snow. The air in the shed felt colder. The storm was not done with her cabin. It was testing every joint and seam. She wiped the snow aside and checked the latch again, making sure it was secure. If the entrance sealed completely under weight, she might not be able to open it from below. If it burst inward, she might be buried where she stood. The hidden shed had saved her from the worst of the wind, but it had also placed her beneath a structure that was failing piece by piece. She looked once more at the small shovel in the corner. The thought of digging upward through layers of snow and broken timber seemed almost impossible. Yet the idea of staying sealed underground carried its own danger. Another dull crack echoed above, followed by a sliding sound that moved from one end of the cabin to the other. The ground trembled faintly beneath her boots. She lifted the lantern and stared at the ceiling beams she had placed with such care. They remained firm for now, but how long would they hold if the cabin above continued to collapse? The storm showed no sign of weakening. The roar outside was as fierce as ever, relentless and cold. Standing there in the small glow of the lantern, beneath layers of earth and snow, she understood that her hidden shed had given her a fighting chance. But whether it would be enough to carry her through what was still unfolding above remained uncertain. And as another heavy impact shook the structure, she realized the true test of her planning had only just begun. The ground shook again, harder this time, and a deep cracking noise rolled across the ceiling beams of the hidden shed. She lifted the lantern high, her eyes searching every inch of wood above her. A thin line had appeared along one of the support planks, no wider than a thread, but it had not been there before. She stepped closer and touched it with her fingertips. The wood felt solid, but the pressure from above was changing. The cabin was no longer simply resisting the storm. It was adjusting under it, bending in places she could not see. Another wave of wind slammed into the structure. Even underground, she could hear the snow scraping across the logs like sand against glass. The chimney, if it still stood, no longer carried smoke. The fire in the stove upstairs had likely gone out when the roof shifted. Cold would be pouring into the main room now, sinking down toward the floorboards. She tried to picture the cabin above her. The table near the window, the iron stove in the corner, the bed pushed against the far wall. Each object had a place, and she knew that place by heart. Now she wondered which of those familiar shapes had been crushed under snow. The idea of losing the cabin struck her deeper than she expected. It was not just a shelter. It was years of work, of careful saving, of lonely evenings spent patching walls and sealing cracks. It was the first thing she had ever built entirely for herself. Another tremor passed through the ground, lighter but steady, like a long sigh. She held still and listened. Beneath the roar of the blizzard she heard something faint. Not the sound of wood this time, something softer. She froze. It came again, almost lost under the wind. A low, uneven scrape, as if something were moving slowly across the snow outside. Her first thought was that it might be a fallen branch dragged by the gusts. But the sound did not follow the rhythm of the wind. It paused, then continued, then paused again. She stepped toward the trapdoor and knelt, pressing her ear against the cold wood. There it was. A faint thump, followed by what could have been a muffled call, quickly swallowed by the storm. Her heart lurched. No one would be foolish enough to travel in this blizzard. The settlement lay miles away, and even in clear weather the journey took time, yet the sound did not fade. It shifted closer to the cabin, uneven and desperate. She stood up slowly, her thoughts racing. If someone was outside in this snowstorm, they would not survive long. But opening the trapdoor now could force snow into the shed. Worse, if the main room was already filled with drifts, she might not even be able to reach the door. The scraping sound came again, louder this time. It struck against the outer wall of the cabin with a dull bump. She made a decision. Clutching the lantern, she lifted the latch and pushed the trapdoor up just enough to peer through the narrow gap. Snow pressed heavily against the edges, but there was still a pocket of air above. The main room was dim and tilted slightly to one side. A large beam had fallen across the table, splitting it cleanly. Snow had poured through a hole in the roof, forming a mound near the stove. The door was completely buried. Another thump hit the wall, followed by a faint cry that carried a tone she recognized. It was not the wind. It was an animal. She pushed the trapdoor wider and pulled herself up into the wrecked cabin. The cold hit her face at once, sharp and biting. Snow swirled through the broken section of roof, dusting the floor in fine powder. She set the lantern on a stable crate and moved toward the sound. At the back wall, near the small window, now half covered in ice, something dark shifted against the logs. It was the old mule. The animal had been tethered in a lean-to beside the cabin before the storm began. She had brought it closer to the house when the wind first rose, hoping the cabin would block the worst of the gusts. Somehow, in the chaos of falling timber and snow, the mule had broken loose and pressed itself against the outer wall, seeking shelter. Now it was nearly buried. Only its head and shoulders were visible, snow packed tight around its body. Its eyes rolled toward her as she approached, wide and frightened. Its breath came in heavy bursts that steamed in the freezing air. She felt a surge of guilt. In her rush to secure the cabin, she had trusted that the lean-to would hold. She had not imagined the roof might fail and shift the snowdrifts toward the animal. She grabbed the shovel leaning near the door and began digging. Each scoop felt heavy. The snow was not light and powdery anymore. It was packed hard by the wind, crusted over with ice. She chipped at it, breaking chunks free and tossing them aside. The mule shifted weakly, trying to pull its legs free. The wind howled through the broken roof, driving snow back into the space she had just cleared. Her hands grew numb despite her gloves. She worked faster, her breath burning in her chest. She could not bring the mule into the hidden shed. The space was too small, built only for her survival, but she could not leave it to freeze against the wall either. It had carried supplies from town, hauled timber for the cabin, stood patient through long days of labor. It had been her quiet companion in this lonely valley. Another crack split the air overhead. She glanced up just in time to see a section of roof sag further, snow sliding down in a heavy sheet. She stepped back instinctively as part of the ceiling gave way completely, crashing onto the floor near the stove. The cabin was losing ground. She forced herself to keep digging. If she could free the mule, she could lead it to the side of the house where the drift was lower. Perhaps she could carve a shallow trench against the cabin wall, giving it some protection from the wind until the storm passed. The animal let out a strained cry as she cleared snow from around its front legs. One leg trembled badly. She feared it might be injured. A new worry settled over her. If the mule was hurt and could not stand, she would not have the strength to lift it alone. And if the storm continued for another day or two, the food she had stored would not matter if she could not reach water once the drifts hardened. Her survival was tied not only to the hidden shed but to the fragile life of the animal struggling beside her. She dug until her arms ached and her shoulders burned. Finally, with one last pull on the rope still tied loosely around its neck, the mule staggered free of the packed snow. It nearly fell, but she braced herself against its side and steadied it. The wind hit them both at once, cutting through her coat like a blade. Snow stung her face. She could barely see beyond a few feet. She led the mule along the cabin wall, searching for a spot less exposed. On the south side, the drift was thinner, blocked partially by a cluster of low bush. She began carving out a shallow hollow there, enough for the animal to crouch and shield itself from the worst of the wind. As she worked, she became aware of another sound beyond the storm. Voices, faint and distant, carried strangely by the gusts. She stopped digging and listened. The mule's breathing was loud beside her, but beyond it she heard something that did not belong to wind or wood. A shout, quickly torn apart by the gale. Someone else was out there. Her mind raced. The nearest ranch lay miles to the west. The settlement sat beyond the hills to the south. No sensible traveler would be on the trail in this blizzard, yet the voice had been real. She scanned the white chaos around her. Shapes shifted in the snow, but none held steady long enough to be recognized. The storm twisted sight and sound until nothing felt certain. If someone was caught in this snowstorm nearby, they would be in grave danger. But leaving the shelter of the cabin now could cost her everything she had prepared for. The hidden shed waited beneath the floor, stocked and ready. The cabin, broken as it was, still offered some barrier against the wind. The voice came again, weaker this time, somewhere beyond the creek. Her heart pounded. The main conflict she had faced all winter had been against nature itself. Now it was becoming something more complicated. Survival was no longer only about her own planning and strength. It was about choice. She looked down at the mule, huddled low in the hollow she had carved. Its sides heaved with each breath. It would not last long without proper shelter. She would need to secure it better, perhaps rig part of the fallen roof as a windbreak. Another shout echoed faintly, then disappeared. The storm showed no sign of easing. Snow continued to pile against the cabin, threatening to bury the hidden shed entrance completely. The roof sagged further with every passing minute. She stood there in the swirling white, torn between the safety she had built and the unknown danger beyond her sight. If she went toward the voice, she risked losing her way in the blizzard. If she stayed, she might condemn someone else to face the storm alone. The wind rose to a higher pitch, almost screaming across the valley. Snow erased the tracks she had just made. She tightened her grip on the shovel and turned her face toward the sound, unsure whether she was about to make the bravest choice of her life or the most foolish. And somewhere out in the white darkness, something moved again. The wind pushed against her back as if it wanted to drive her inside and nail the door shut behind her. Snow whipped across her face, stinging her eyes until tears blurred her sight. She stood frozen for only a second longer, listening for that voice again. The valley answered with a roar. Then it came, faint but clear enough to cut through the storm. A single cry, carried from beyond the creek. She made her choice. She turned to the mule first. The animal was crouched low in the hollow she had carved, its body trembling but shielded somewhat by the bush and the drifted snow. She worked quickly, dragging a wide plank from the broken section of roof and propping it against the windward side. The wood sank into the snow at an angle, forming a rough barrier. It was not perfect, but it would block the worst of the gusts. She ran her hand along the mule's neck, feeling its warmth under her glove. "Stay," she whispered, though her voice vanished in the wind. The animal's dark eye followed her as she stepped away. She grabbed a coil of rope from inside the cabin and tied one end securely to the thick post that still stood firm near the doorway. The other end she wrapped around her waist and knotted tight. If she lost her footing in the whiteout, the rope might guide her back. The hidden shed waited beneath the floor, stocked with food, lantern oil, blankets. It had been her safeguard against a snowstorm just like this, but now survival meant stepping away from it. She lowered her head against the gale and moved toward the creek. Each step felt uncertain. Snow had erased the familiar shape of the land. The small rise that led down to the frozen water was hidden beneath a smooth, deceptive surface. Her boots sank deep, sometimes to her knees. The rope tugged behind her, already growing taut. The wind howled across the open stretch near the creek, stronger there without the cabin to block it. She leaned forward, forcing her way through the white wall. Her breath came hard and sharp in her chest. "Where are you?" she shouted, though the sound barely carried beyond her own ears. For a long moment there was nothing but wind. Then she saw movement. A dark shape shifted against the pale blur near the edge of the creek bank. It was low to the ground, half swallowed by snow. She stumbled closer, wiping ice from her lashes. A wagon. It lay tipped on its side, one wheel spinning weakly in the gusts. The canvas cover had been ripped loose and snapped wildly like a torn sail. Beside it, nearly buried, was a figure struggling to rise. She rushed forward, nearly losing her footing on the slick crust of snow over the frozen creek. The rope at her waist jerked tight as she reached its limit. She untied it quickly, knowing she would not make it back if she stayed bound so short. The figure tried to stand but fell again, arms flailing against the drift. She reached them and dropped to her knees, brushing snow away from a face pale with cold. It was a young boy, no more than 10 or 11, his cheeks raw from the wind. His lips were blue, his eyelashes crusted with ice. He tried to speak, but his teeth chattered too hard for words to form. Her heart clenched. "Where is the driver?" she asked, though she did not know if he could answer. He lifted a shaking hand and pointed weakly toward the wagon. She turned and crawled through the snow to the overturned frame. A second shape lay partially trapped beneath it. An older man, perhaps his father, pinned at the shoulder by the broken sideboard. His eyes were open but unfocused. The storm had caught them on the trail and thrown the wagon as if it were a toy. She dug frantically at the snow packed around the trapped man. The wood was heavy, soaked, and frozen. She braced her boots and pushed with all her strength. It shifted slightly but did not lift enough. The wind roared louder, driving snow into her face and down her collar. She forced herself to think clearly. Panic would waste precious time. She crawled to the other side of the wagon and shoved again, using the frozen creek bank as leverage. The wheel creaked, and the frame tilted just enough for the trapped man to pull his arm free. He gasped and rolled away from the wreck, coughing hard. She dragged him clear, inch by inch, until both he and the boy were clear of the broken wagon. They would not survive long out here. The cabin, even damaged, was closer than the settlement. The hidden shed beneath it offered warmth and supplies. But the walk back would be brutal, especially with two weakened people who could barely stand. She pulled the boy upright and wrapped his arm over her shoulder. "We have to move," she said firmly. His eyes met hers, wide with fear but still aware. The older man tried to rise on his own. He staggered but stayed upright long enough to take a few steps. The wind pushed against them, as if trying to drive them back to the creek. Snow swallowed their footprints almost instantly. She searched for the faint line of rope she had left trailing from the cabin, but it was gone beneath the drifts. They were alone in a white maze. She turned toward where she believed the cabin stood, using the direction of the wind as her guide. It struck her left shoulder as it had before when she walked out. If she kept it there, she might stay on course. Step by step, they pushed forward. The boy stumbled often. Twice she had to stop and pull him back to his feet. The older man moved slower with each stride, his breathing harsh and uneven. The cabin did not appear when she expected it to. The storm twisted distance, making everything feel farther away. Fear crept into her chest. Had she veered too far south? Had the wind shifted without her noticing? She stopped and squinted through the white blur. There, barely visible, was the dark outline of the cabin's broken roof. Relief surged through her, but it was short-lived. The structure looked worse than when she left. A larger section of roof had collapsed entirely, leaving one wall leaning at an angle. Snow had piled high against the doorway, almost to the height of the window. They stumbled toward it. She guided them around to the south side where the drift was lower. The mule's hollow still held, the makeshift plank barrier standing against the gusts. The animal lifted its head weakly as they approached. She did not waste time. "Inside?" she urged, leading them through the damaged main room. Snow had filled nearly half the space. The stove was buried. The fallen beam split the floor at a sharp angle. She shoved aside what she could and pulled the rug free from the trapdoor. The boy stared at her in confusion as she lifted the hidden entrance. Warmth rose faintly from below, mixed with the steady glow of the lantern she had left burning low. "Down," she said. She lowered the boy first, then helped the older man descend carefully into the hidden shed. When they were inside, she followed, pulling the trapdoor shut behind her. The roar of the storm dulled immediately. In the small underground space, the lantern light flickered softly against the packed earth walls. The shelves of food and water stood untouched. The cot waited in the corner. The boy sank onto it, shivering violently. The older man leaned against the wall, eyes closed, chest rising and falling in shallow breaths. She moved quickly, wrapping them both in blankets from the shelf. She poured a small cup of water and held it to the boy's lips. He drank greedily, coughing between gulps. The hidden shed, built months ago in quiet preparation, was now sheltering more than just her. It was holding back the storm for 3 lives. But above them, the cabin groaned again. A heavy crash shook the ceiling beams, followed by the unmistakable sound of logs shifting and settling. Dust rained down from the cracks between planks. The lantern flame trembled wildly. The older man's eyes snapped open. "The house," he rasped. She nodded grimly. If the remaining walls gave way completely, the weight of the roof and snow could press down onto the shed. The support beams might hold, but they were not meant to carry the entire cabin. Another violent tremor rippled through the ground. This one lasted longer than the others. The ceiling beams bent slightly, just enough to make her breath catch. The boy clutched the blanket tighter around his shoulders. Fear filled his eyes, reflecting the lantern light. She stepped to the center of the shed and placed both hands against the strongest support beam, as if she could lend it her strength. The wood felt solid, but the pressure above was increasing. The storm outside had not weakened at all. The wind still screamed across the valley, driving more snow against the broken structure. They had escaped the open whiteout, but now they were beneath a collapsing cabin. She met the older man's gaze. He understood the danger. The hidden shed had saved them from freezing on the trail, but it might become their trap if the cabin fell completely. Another cracking sound split the air overhead, louder than any before. The beam beneath her palms creaked in answer. For a heartbeat, everything held still. Then came a long, splintering roar from above as the remaining roof gave way. The ground shuddered violently, and the lantern nearly toppled from its hook. She closed her eyes and braced herself as the full weight of the storm came crashing down. The crash above them felt like the sky had fallen. Wood splintered, snow slammed down in a heavy rush. The ceiling beams of the hidden shed groaned under sudden weight, bending just enough to make her heart stop. Dust and bits of dry earth sifted down into her hair and onto the blankets wrapped around the boy. For one long breath, she thought the entire cabin would crush them. She kept her hands pressed against the main support beam, as if her strength alone could hold it upright. The older man pulled the boy closer, shielding him with his own body. The lantern swung wildly on its hook, throwing trembling shadows across the packed earth walls. Then, slowly, the shaking eased. The roaring of the storm still filled the air, but the violent splintering stopped. The weight above had settled. Snow and broken logs had fallen into place, forming a new shape over the hidden shed. She opened her eyes and forced herself to breathe. The beam under her hands had not snapped. It bowed slightly, but it held. The other supports remained steady, driven deep into the earth months ago, when she had carved this space with blistered hands and stubborn faith. The hidden shed had done what she built it to do. It had saved her during a snowstorm. And now it was saving them all. The boy's shivering began to slow as the blankets trapped warmth around him. She moved quickly, pouring a small portion of water into a tin cup and adding a handful of dried corn to a pot. She set it over a small lantern flame she had prepared for cooking in tight spaces. It was not much, but warm food would help. The older man tried to stand, but she motioned for him to stay seated. "Rest," she said firmly. "You are safe for now." He looked at her with eyes that carried both exhaustion and gratitude. "You built this," he said quietly, glancing around the underground shelter. She nodded once. He let out a slow breath. "If not for this shed, we would be buried out there." The word buried hung heavy in the small space. She knew he was right. The wagon lay overturned near the creek, already disappearing under drifting snow. The cabin above them was broken, its roof collapsed. Without the hidden shelter carved beneath it, the blizzard would have claimed them all. The storm raged on for hours. They could feel its force in the faint tremors that passed through the earth and the steady pressure on the beams overhead, but nothing else gave way. The hidden shed, protected by packed soil and reinforced wood, remained strong. As night deepened, the wind began to change. It no longer screamed at the same pitch. It dropped lower, steadier. The heavy impacts against the cabin debris grew less frequent. She listened carefully, measuring the storm by sound alone. The boy drifted into an uneasy sleep, wrapped tight in blankets. The older man dozed in short stretches, waking each time the wind rose suddenly. She stayed awake longer than either of them, tending the lantern, checking the beams, listening to the world above. Near dawn, the roar softened. The silence that followed felt almost louder than the storm. They waited several minutes, hardly daring to believe it. Then she stood slowly and moved toward the trapdoor. Snow pressed heavily against it, but the violent shifting had stopped. She looked back at the older man. He met her eyes and nodded. With careful hands, she unlatched the door and pushed upward. At first it did not move. She pushed harder, bracing her shoulder beneath it. Snow packed against the top resisted stubbornly. Finally, with a grinding sound, the trapdoor lifted just enough to let a thin line of pale light spill into the shed. She blinked against it. The storm had passed. Cold, clean daylight shone down through what used to be the cabin floor. The roof was gone entirely, replaced by a mound of snow and broken logs. The walls leaned inward but still formed a rough outline of the room. She pushed the door wider and climbed up carefully. The world outside had been transformed. The valley lay silent and white, smooth as untouched cloth. Snowdrifts rose taller than the fence posts. The creek was hidden beneath a thick blanket of ice and powder. Not a single tree branch moved. The sky was clear and pale blue, as if the storm had never existed. She turned slowly, taking in the damage. The cabin had collapsed across most of its length. The section directly above the hidden shed had fallen inward, but created a slanted pocket that deflected the heaviest weight to either side. It was luck, perhaps, but it was also design. She had placed the shed slightly offset from the center for that very reason. The mule stirred in its hollow, still alive. The plank windbreak remained in place, half buried but standing. Relief washed through her so strongly that her knees nearly gave out. She climbed back down and helped the boy and the older man up one at a time. The cold air struck their faces, but it no longer carried the deadly bite of driving wind. The older man stood in the ruins of the cabin and stared at the wreckage. "We would not have lasted another hour out there," he said quietly. She looked across the valley toward the distant hills. Thin trails of smoke were rising from two faraway cabins. Others had survived too. They spent the next hours digging carefully around the shed entrance to clear a safer path. The older man, though stiff and sore, insisted on helping. The boy gathered smaller pieces of wood that could be salvaged from the broken roof. The cabin was damaged beyond quick repair, but not beyond hope. Many of the lower logs remained solid. The stove, though buried, could likely be freed and used again. It would take weeks of hard labor, but it could be rebuilt. As they worked, the older man explained their journey. They had left the settlement late, hoping to reach a ranch west of the creek before nightfall. The sky had seemed clear enough at first. The snowstorm had rolled in faster than anyone expected, swallowing the trail before they could turn back. He shook his head. "I have lived in this valley all my life. I have seen winter, but this was different," she understood. The land did not follow promises. It demanded respect and preparation. By afternoon, the boy's color had returned to his cheeks. He walked more steadily, his fear replaced by curiosity as he peered into the hidden shed. "You built this under your cabin?" he asked. "Yes," she replied simply. He looked at her with open admiration. "It saved us," the words settled warmly in her chest. The mule was led carefully to a cleared patch where it could stand more comfortably. Its leg, though sore, was not broken. With rest and care, it would recover. As the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the snow-covered valley, the older man made a decision. "When the trail is passable, I will return with help," he said. "We will rebuild this cabin stronger than before." She studied the broken logs around them. The hidden shed had proven its worth. Next time, she would design the roof to carry heavier snow. She would anchor the beams deeper. She would not abandon this land. The storm had tested her, just as the old settlers had warned. It had torn apart her home, buried her door, and nearly taken 2 lives on the frozen creek. But it had also proven something else. Preparation mattered. Quiet determination mattered. A hidden shelter built with care could mean the difference between loss and survival. As evening settled gently over the valley, she stood outside the ruins of her cabin and looked across the wide white prairie. The air was still. The sky glowed soft with fading light. The hidden shed beneath her feet remained strong and dry. It was no longer just a precaution carved into earth. It was a symbol of foresight, of resilience in the face of a brutal winter. The boy laughed suddenly as the mule nudged his shoulder, searching for oats. The sound rang clear in the cold air. She smiled. The snowstorm had come without mercy. It had broken wood and buried doors, but it had not broken her. With steady hands and steady heart, she would rebuild. And beneath the new cabin, deeper and stronger than before, the hidden shed would remain, ready for whatever winter might bring next.